All right, guys, this is the notes for chapter 16. This is going to be part 1 of 2. We're going to spend 2 weeks on this chapter. It's all about the actual Civil War. The learning target for this chapter is to understand the advantages, strategies, important leaders, and significant events of the Civil War, be able to explain how these shape the beginning, middle, and end of the war. We've got a bunch of stuff that we're going to do in class. We will be reading Soldier's Heart again this week. Make sure you keep up on that. The bell work, for those of you at home, you don't have to go through this. I do want you to know the vocabulary. You can look that over when you get the chance. Some of the vocabulary goes in your Soldier's Heart packet. And, you don't have to read necessarily the articles of the day if you're only doing class online. The big idea is basically the Civil War tore the nation apart and was the defining event of the 1800s. So when you learn about the 1800s in America, you learn about everything before the war is what led up to the war. Then you learn about the Civil War. And then the latter part of the 1800s is about Reconstruction and what happened after the war. So the big event here is the Civil War, and even though it only lasted for 4 years, it pretty much shaped the rest of the 1800s. So it's a very big event in U.S. history. Let's get started. So last time on chapter 15, we learned that when Lincoln took office, 7 states had already left the Union. Lincoln has kind of one last-ditch effort to promise not to end slavery or attack the South, but he also promises that he will do everything he can to preserve the Union. The South does not believe or listen to Lincoln's call for unity, and so the Civil War is going to begin. When shots are fired at Fort Sumter, which is a fort in South Carolina, in April 1861. What happens is this was a Union fort in a strategic location. Confederate troops from South Carolina show up and tell the Union troops to leave. They refuse. There ends up being kind of a firefight, 34 hours of shooting back and forth at each other. The Union soldiers eventually surrender the fort as they run out of ammunition. And this is considered to be the first battle of the Civil War. No one was actually killed in the fighting during Fort Sumter until the Union soldiers were getting ready to surrender the fort. They were doing a salute with guns, and one of the guns backfired, and a Union soldier was killed. That was the first casualty of the Civil War. After this event, Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called a revolt at this point. As soon as fighting begins, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas all join the Confederacy. So you can see the lines drawn here. The dark blue states of the Union and the dark orange states of the Confederacy, with light blue being Union territories and light orange being Confederate territories. You might notice the yellow states. These were called border states. There were 4 slave states that did not secede from the Union but were very important. The first 2, Kentucky and Missouri, controlled parts of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and these were important transportation, strategic transportation waterways for the North. And so it was important to keep those 2 states as part of the Union so that they could transport troops around, especially into some of the areas of the West where there was fighting. And then Maryland and Delaware, obviously very close to Washington, D.C., and so this was also strategically important. If they would have lost Maryland and Delaware, it would have been very difficult for the Union, the North, to keep Washington, D.C. as its capital. 5th border state becomes West Virginia when it splits from Virginia in 1861. Slavery was not as important in the western part of what was Virginia, and so they broke away from Virginia and became their own state, and this was also considered a border state. These were border states because they allowed slavery again. The other thing that was important here is many of the battles took place in these states because you have the 2 sides kind of meeting in the middle. These states were very divided and kind of a tough situation for many of the people in those states. We're going to talk about advantages. Looking at the Civil War, a lot of people thought that the North was going to win easily because they had larger population, about 2 to 1, more factories and shipyards, they had better railways and transportation, and they had a lot more money. The South looked to be the weaker of the two sides. However, the things that they had really helped them, especially in the beginning of the war. First was military tradition. Many of the places where soldiers trained were in the South, and so many of our best leaders were from the South, and they stayed with the Confederacy when the war broke out. And then the second advantage was that the South just had to defend themselves and wear down the Union's will to fight. They didn't have to go attack, and so the Union had to come to them. They knew the areas they were fighting better than the Union did, and that was going to help them at the beginning of the war quite a bit. Strategies for the North and South. The Union strategy was created by the longest serving general in U.S. history, Winfield Scott. It was called Scott's Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan. Basically, what they were going to do is surround the South and cut off their supplies. This was going to eventually be an effective strategy. One of the reasons why is the South didn't have a navy, and so the Union was going to use its navy to cut off any sort of goods going in and out of the South. The other part of this plan was for the Union to take the Mississippi to divide the Confederacy, cut its communication, and this also served as a place that the Union soldiers could easily get troops to and attack from. The Confederate strategy, basically to defend its territory and wear down the Union's will to fight. They did want to take Washington, D.C., since it was fairly close to the Confederacy. And then the last little thing that they tried to do here is called cotton diplomacy. And cotton was an important trade good on the world stage. And so what the South was hoping is that by promising other countries cotton, they could get another country to join with them, specifically a country with a navy, to join with them and help them as they fought the North in exchange for cheap or free cotton. This is not going to happen ever. But the South kept hoping that if they had one major battle, it would be enough to convince another world power to come and join them. So that was the thought. Now we'll start talking about the war in the East here. Leaders of the two sides. Robert E. Lee, he is going to be the overall leader of the South throughout the entire war. He was actually given the option by Lincoln to be the leader of the Union Army, and he had a choice to make, just like Jefferson Davis and many of the other Southern leaders. This was a very difficult choice for him. He either had to choose to be a traitor to his country or to his state. Ultimately, he loved Virginia and did not want to attack his home state, so he chooses to be the leader of the Confederate Army, considered to be a very good military leader throughout the Civil War. One of his best generals was Thomas Stonewall Jackson, a West Point graduate. He got the nickname Stonewall in one of the very first battles that he was in, where one of his men saw him during a Union charge standing like a stone wall, and the nickname kind of stuck with him. He was considered to be one of the best military commanders of all time. 1863, things start going wrong for the Confederacy, and one of the things that goes wrong is Stonewall Jackson is shot by friendly fire and eventually dies. You can also see he lost an arm in the Civil War and kept fighting. His death is going to be a big loss for the Confederacy in the middle of the war. Union war leaders, this is a little bit more complicated of a picture here. We're going to kind of give you a brief overview. It gets a little bit more complicated than what we're going to talk about. But what you need to know is that George McClellan was one of the main leaders of the Union Army at the beginning of the war. He was put in charge. He was also a West Point graduate. He was known as a guy who was good at planning before battles. He successfully built up the Union Army. He was notoriously bad at leading during the middle of a battle. There were many times during the war when people felt like McClellan could have crushed the Confederacy if he would have been a little more aggressive. that just wasn't really his nature. So he gets criticized for that. Specifically, he gets criticized by President Lincoln, and him and Lincoln do not get along very well. And Lincoln fires him in 1862, and McClellan decides to run against Lincoln for president shortly after, and might have won if the war had not turned around right before the presidential election in 1864. McClellan was very popular among the troops. Some say because he did not make them fight as much as, you know, Lincoln and other generals maybe would have. That was Lincoln's big problem with McClellan, is he just felt like he was not aggressive enough. So eventually, Lincoln is going to settle on Ulysses S. Grant as the leader of his Union Army. And Grant was a West Point graduate, served in the Mexican-American War, re-enlisted when the Civil War broke out. He was originally sent to Tennessee, where he had a great deal of success fighting. He was known for being extremely aggressive, and because of that, Lincoln eventually chooses for him to lead the Union Army, and that's exactly what Lincoln says about him. I can't spare this man, he fights. Grant is going to be the person who gets credit for winning the Civil War, and later uses that success to become president of the United States. The first major battles, where it was more than just a little skirmish, took place near Washington, D.C. in July 1861. They were called, depending on, the North called it the First and Second Battles of Bull Run. The South called it First and Second Manassas. It was a series of battles about a year apart. In the first battle, the Union troops began pushing the Confederates back. However, Stonewall Jackson holds his troops firmly in place. Fresh Confederate soldiers arrive and push the Union soldiers back. The Union soldiers are not completely organized yet, and they retreat to Washington, D.C. The Confederate force is also kind of disorganized. They don't follow them to D.C. Many thought that the North was going to win easily, so this first battle of Bull Run, ended the Union's hopes of winning the war quickly and easily. Some people thought that this war was going to be a matter of months instead of years, which it eventually turns out to be. Second Bull Run, 1862, a similar result. Lee and the Confederacy drive the Union out of Virginia. Two major battles, both won by the South, and that was kind of the theme of the beginning of the Civil War. The North did not lose every battle. On September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam took place. Unknown to the Confederates, General McClellan obtained a copy of the Confederate battle plan, and so he knew exactly what was going to happen. Planned a perfect counterattack. 40,000 Confederate soldiers were fighting in this versus a similarly sized Union force. Somewhere around 20,000 people died in one day of fighting. This was the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. Eventually, at the end of the day, the Union wins. But similarly to Bull Run, as the Confederates were retreating, McClellan does not follow them. He allows Lee to retreat to Virginia and regroup. This is the point where Lincoln replaces McClellan, and McClellan decides to run for president. At sea, the North had a huge advantage. They blockaded the South with their navy. The South did not have ships to be able to really fight back on the sea. They did have small blockade runners that could get some goods into the South, but overall, the Southern economy is going to be hurting once this blockade really takes hold. One other thing that's known about the war at sea is both sides built a new ship called the Ironclad. The Confederate ironclad was called the Virginia, sank some wooden Union ships. The Union eventually sends its own ironclad, the Monitor, after the Virginia. There's kind of this first battle between two iron ships. The problem was neither one of these ships had the firepower to really sink the other, so neither side really had too much of an advantage. The Union had an advantage throughout the war just because they had a much, much bigger navy than the Confederacy. That's all we're going to go through on this section. I'm going to make another section for next week that's part 2 of the Civil War.